Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Shaken Not Burned. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at one of the key pillars of climate and sustainability, the protection of nature. Nature underpins everything. Our food systems, our water supplies, health, and ultimately our economies. It often slips down the agenda, overshadowed by climate targets and social debates, even geopolitical tension. Partly because the stakes feel so self-evident, and partly because nature's always been one of the hardest things to talk about in business terms, without losing a sense of nature as a public good, of why it actually matters. But the evidence is no longer subtle. Economic and policy analysis is showing that biodiversity loss, climate change, and resource pressures are deeply interconnected. The trouble is they amplify each other. Treating them as separate problems doesn't just fail to solve them, it can even make things worse. Despite that, we know that investor and corporate action on biodiversity and nature is remaining thin. Only a small minority of large companies have got meaningful commitments to protecting nature, even though most businesses depend directly or even indirectly on healthy ecosystems. Whether that's through their supply chains, their physical assets, or even the well-being of the people they serve. Once you include value chains, there are very few businesses that aren't exposed to the impact of the loss of nature. And that's the question today. It's no longer a question of whether we need to finance nature protection. We know we do. Governments are increasingly signalling that we have to, through things like biodiversity net gain requirements or nature-positive targets, even global commitments to halt and reverse the global loss of nature under the Global Biodiversity Framework. If we're going to finance nature, the question then becomes we need to think about how we're going to finance that protection. How, who's going to do it, and under what rules. Just like climate, we're often told that markets are going to save us through carbon credits and biodiversity credits and offsets and a whole new range of contribution models. But there are challenges with all of them. While market-based mechanisms can mobilise capital at scale, they often rely on simplifications that struggle to capture the complexity of ecology. There's challenges around the time horizons that nature requires and finance does not respond to. And there's problems about overclaiming impact and false confidence. Philanthropy and public funding are critical, but they're typically fragmented, underfunded, and vulnerable to political cycles, and we're seeing the impact of that everywhere these days. Across all of these models, the same problems show up. Weak links between finance and long-term stewardship, limited transparency for contributors, uneven benefit sharing with Indigenous and local communities, and a tendency to treat nature as a compensatable unit rather than a living system with limits. The result is a landscape where there is funding, but trust and the durable protection that comes with that remains fragile. So that's why today we're talking to Rob Cobbold, founder of Native Squared. Native Squared works with both individuals and companies, and their approach is deliberately different from many mainstream nature and carbon finance models. Instead of credits or distant promises, they focus on small, mapped pieces of real land or ocean tied to long-term protection and stewardship, and usually in partnership with Indigenous and local communities. For individuals, they offer a way to support the protection of real ecosystems for whatever reason, whether that's climate concern, love of nature, or just because they want to give it as a present. For businesses, they've got tools that make it operational, so dashboards and reporting, even checkout integrations. So nature funding can be plugged into a company's customer journey or its internal culture, not just sit around in a sustainability report. So I don't think the aim of what Native Squared is doing is to solve nature and biodiversity loss with a new product. It's to rethink how nature protection is funded, who pays, who benefits, how trust is built, and where the limits are. So in this episode, we are not going to be asking about whether nature has value. We know that it does. What we want to know is, what does credible nature finance look like? How do we avoid How do we avoid turning care for nature, investment into nature, into compensation for harm that's happening elsewhere? And how should we as individuals and companies judge the growing number of claims that are being made in the name of biodiversity? So first of all, Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Felicia. What an intro. I mean, you framed the issue so well that I almost feel like you don't need me here at all.
I want to hear your perspective on it and understand what Native Squared is doing and how it's different from other approaches to conservation and nature finance out there. I think the first thing I'd love to know is, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this area?
Yeah, sure. So, I had a huge spiritual awakening when I was 21, and it was not something I was seeking or looking for. It happened quite spontaneously, and it completely changed my life. But one of the things that came out of that was this realization that actually I was here to be of service. So to be honest, my career has been one long attempt to answer that question in the best way that I can at the time. So that led me into, I was always interested in climate change. I remember learning about it when I was doing my AS levels, biology, and they sort of mentioned, oh yeah, there's this thing called climate change. I remember thinking, hold on a minute, that seems like really important to be a sort of footnote in my kind of biology, curriculum.
Yeah.
So it was always something that I was interested in and I thought was important. And then I started speaking in schools when I left university. So I spoke to about 30,000 young people about the climate crisis for a couple of organizations called the Green Schools Project and We Charity. Then I was could see where that was going, and I started to investigate, okay, what does corporate climate action look like? Can I be useful there? And so I started working for a think tank, which was largely a waste of time. I don't feel like we were actually moving the dial at all, but it at least gave me an introduction into corporate sustainability and how that world operates, at least in part. And then from there, met my co-founder, Chris, and we founded a couple of different startups really aimed at getting to what we saw as the core of these kind of systemic issues, which is really about aligning incentives. It's the incentive misalignment that is the problem. So we started looking at currency design and social media design, because two of the things that human beings respond to most are our reputations and our wallets. And clearly money is incentivizing greed and extraction, and social media tends to incentivize polarizing content, drives us apart rather than pulling us together. So we founded a startup called the Beach Collective, which redesigned and re-envisioned these two things and tried to make an ecosystem where these things would all work together. And then that kind of led to Native Squared.
Okay.
Which is essentially about, exactly as you said, rethinking nature markets from the ground up, not kind of doing what carbon markets have done, which is almost like they've been designed in a spreadsheet to make the maths work. And then only later did people look up and see if it's actually helpful for nature. So we sort of, let's start with nature and communities first, and then join it to corporates and corporate climate action.
What I absolutely love about that is the point you make about understanding where the levers for change are and what you can and can't do to move the dial. Because I think one of the things that happens to a lot of people is they feel very powerless because we are given the choices in front of us that are created by the system we're in, and actually understanding what those are is the first step towards changing the way in which you respond to them. The things I think would be really useful to understand more clearly is that when you first started thinking about Native Squared, what was it that felt wrong or unsatisfying or perhaps even broken about the way in which nature protection is generally being funded and in fact talked about?
Well, I mean, almost everything. I mean, there's philanthropy, right, which is great, but corporate climate finance or corporate nature finance, it just has so many poor first principles written in right at the beginning. I mean, just right off the bat, you can't reduce the value of nature to carbon, obviously.
Yeah.
By that framework, coral reefs are largely useless. Because the only thing that companies care about is additional carbon, it also means that intact, pristine ecosystems like rainforest are almost impossible to fund. Because you have to prove that the rainforest would have been chopped down had you not financed it, which sounds intuitive, but in practice what that creates is a global disincentive for governments anywhere to legally protect their ecosystems, because otherwise the certifiers come along and say, look, it's legally protected, so it's not under threat, it's not additional. Meanwhile, if I start chopping down half of my forest, I can point to the rest of it and I can go, look, it's under threat, it's additional, and then I get the finance. And this is playing out on a global level. I mean, Gabon is an example which has done an unbelievable job of protecting their rainforest. So they've got very little deforestation, very little threat to the forest, and as a result, they can't access almost any carbon market finance, which is the
Crazy.
exact opposite of what we should be doing, right? I mean, and you'd think biodiversity credits might solve this problem by valuing biodiverse places, and yet almost every single biodiversity credit on the market values uplift only. So you're faced with the exact same problem. Intact ecosystems, not valuable. The only one we found that solves that problem is Savimbo, which is why we adopted them, which I think are amazing. Do check them out. Then there's just sort of like sloppy thinking, or sometimes like actually kind of condescending thinking about Indigenous communities. Like when I was speaking to someone the other day saying, if you're protecting intact rainforests like from logging, then we can't just pay Indigenous communities to do nothing. And I was, well, that is how most of the economy works, actually. Like, I mean, we're not trying to, are we trying to abolish interest-bearing debt and the whole rental market as well? But somehow the problem is communities in place who are often protecting enormous tracts of forest for no money at all, living under huge economic and political pressure, often lacking basic needs. And yet all we need to do is outbid the logging company. It's as simple as that. And we understand that in all other parts of the economy. Why would it be different in a rainforest? But somehow that idea was as if they're a bunch of freeloaders creaming in loads of money. So that's another example. And then the other one is this thing that I hear a lot in corporate climate action. We need more data. We need more data before we can take action. And it's like, do you know what? We don't actually need more data to know that rainforest needs protecting. We don't need more data to know that mangroves need restoring. We have an abundance of data, but we don't share it with each other, and we don't really know how to synthesize it. And more data might mean more accuracy, but it's also an enormous waste of resources in this space. The amount of money spent on consultants and bean counters who will come in and calculate your emissions for you dwarfs by something like 10 to 1 the amount that companies are actually spending on nature. So stop chasing certainty, accept some ambiguity, and take action. And I think what underpins all of these things, it's a deeper civilizational level problem, which is we have this left brain bias where we love abstract, quantifiable, measurable metrics. We love taking dynamic, complex, beautiful things like nature and reducing them to abstract things that we can, that are static, that we can measure and analyze. And that's fine if I'm trying to decarbonize my factory, but it's a disaster if I'm trying to value and finance nature. And I think that the left brain bias that affects our whole civilization shows up very heavily in corporate climate action and in nature finance. And we need to address that at root.
There's a couple of things there that I thought were fascinating, one of which is this issue about the financial mindset when looking at the problem, and this idea that there is, I suppose it's almost like going back to that Victorian sense, that there's some people that are worthy of being supported and some who aren't, which is crazy. And what you talk about in terms of the abstract measurement just literally makes me want to go on a rant about economics again, which to our regular listeners will not be a surprise, but it is the very way in which we reduce everything to a manageable model means that you miss everything in it that matters.
Exactly.
Which is absolutely crazy.
Exactly. And what you said at the beginning of the difficulty of communicating, even just communicating about nature and nature finance in a corporate setting. I mean, like one of the, I don't know if I love this stat because it's hilarious or I loathe it, but it's like, the stat like, 50% of GDP is heavily dependent on nature.
Yes.
It's like, what are you talking about? There's no life without nature. Like all of human existence, all of life on Earth, like we are nature, And I understand the intention is to try and frame it in terms that finance can then get on board with. But we can't keep coming from this schizophrenic place where nature is this thing out there and not in here. And it has this GDP value. It's like, no. It underpins the basis of all life on Earth. It is life on Earth,
Yeah.
Let's start from there. And by all means, we do need to work out how we plug this into financial markets, right? That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
But if you start from where markets are and work towards nature, you're going to end up in this completely schizophrenic, completely insane place, which is where we've landed.
Well, you mentioned corals and them not having value because they don't work for carbon sequestration. And I'm just thinking, what about cleaning the water and homes for species and spawning grounds and all those things that underpin things people can put a value on because it's fisheries and it's tourism and all of these things. You mentioned the schizophrenia of it, and I think there is a real challenge that we do see nature as something that should be protected, and it should be a public good because it does underpin all life on Earth. But at the same time, communicating with finance people in ways that make sense is really, really challenging. And I think the time horizon is a huge problem with this because investment tends to have a very short time horizon and nature and biodiversity protection has a long time horizon. And that is a conflict that is really, really hard to overcome with existing models. But I think you're right. We need to start thinking about it in different ways. And if we start looking at different approaches to how we do conservation and protection, we might then be able to build a financial model on the back of it. I also loved your point about data, because that is the thing that is going on constantly and it drives me nuts. We may need more data for a forward model of what the climate might do. But as you say, we know what's going on. We know that action has to be taken. So we just need to do it. So this is what you're doing with Native Squared. Okay, so this idea of these small mapped out squares of land. So it's real land, areas of ocean. That's really intuitive because it's money that goes directly to protecting a piece of reality of the world in which we live. But how do you actually explain that to somebody when they're looking to give a payment for it? How do you explain what people are really supporting?
So one of the most common questions that we get is, how do you actually protect the rainforest? And I think there is this misconception that it involves sort of going out with torches at night and stopping these illegal logging and building fences. And, and no doubt in some places, in some areas, that is what's needed. But the truth is that it's just going to vary completely from project to project, from ecosystem to ecosystem. I mean, we're also going to do restoration projects, in marine restoration projects, right? So how do you restore coral reefs is just a completely different question, right? But in terms of the first project that we have, which is protecting intact, pristine rainforest, actually the main threat to that forest is legal logging. Like I say, these communities are under huge economic and political pressure. Actually, there was an Indigenous governor who basically kicked out a lot of the logging companies and, face death threats and this kind of thing going on. The reality is, like most places, like most economies, if you want to outcompete the logging companies, you have to outbid the logging companies. And the crazy thing about this is that if I say to you, how much does it cost to sequester a ton of carbon? When people on the street don't know and they don't care, it doesn't mean anything to them, that question. And if I take our forest and I do a sort of purely carbon reductionist analysis on the additional carbon, the amount that you would get per square is so little, it's not actually enough to outbid the logging company. It's not enough to do the job that you need to do, the primary job. Okay. But if I say to someone, how much do you think it costs to protect this much rainforest? And I'm, for those who are listening, or audio, I'm holding out my arms. That if you hold out your arms, that is the size of a native square. People say $20,000, $100,000. We've had people say millions of dollars because it's intrinsically and intuitively valuable, a square of rainforest. That actually does mean something to people. But the real answer is £5. For £5, you can outbid a logging company for an area that big. And everybody who hears that goes, well, that's a bargain. Like, of course I'll do that. So we've been framing it to people in the wrong way. Because we've been so focused on making it work for financial markets, we've been packaging it in a way which real people just roll their eyes at. Yeah. I mean, maybe I have managed to achieve my net zero target as a large corporate. But let's assume I have done it in all the right ways. I've been very rigorous. Great, good for you. But your employees and clients, they're just going to roll their eyes when they hear, oh, we're carbon neutral, because it smacks of bullshit. So even with the best,
there's too many people saying too many things in different ways and they're not comparable and it's just confused everybody.
And it doesn't mean anything to people, carbon neutral. No, nothing is ever carbon neutral in nature. It doesn't work like that. It's much more complex than that. It's not a binary left or right thing. And it gives the impression that, like, oh, right, so therefore you're completely culpable. You're guilt-free. You're completely not part of the problem. And no organization, no individual is not both part of the problem and part of the solution. Yeah. And the kind of net zero narrative it feels overly simplistic and it doesn't speak to people.
That is the biggest problem. It's how people understand the impact of what they're doing and how you can use people's understanding of that to actually translate that into protection. I think one of the things that I have a question about is how the model works. Because it's one thing to say, okay, it's £5 for a square of Amazonian rainforest. But when you have any model, there are choices you make. As you say, we are all part of the problem and part of the solution. So how do you deal with trade-offs? Are there conscious trade-offs that you have to make? And I suppose what I'm really interested in is, are those trade-offs around things like simplicity or communicability and credibility and scale?
They absolutely are. For our first project, for example, we decided not to go down a kind of official carbon accreditation certification route with Vero or Gold Standard. The reality is that that does make it hard to sell at scale to certain large corporates. Interestingly, the really, really large corporates who have more money than God, they often don't mind about this, and they can invest in nature protection without needing these types of things. The very, very small companies also can, but if you're in that middle bracket and you're being caught up in some EU regulation, you just want to tick the box and have the certified carbon credit. Unfortunately, this sounds like a great idea to have these independent bodies that certify, but in practice, they're huge industry gatekeepers. I mean, basically, to certify my carbon project, you need sort of 6 figures.
Right.
And again, that's great if I'm doing millions of hectares, but if I'm a small Indigenous community, it just ignores the realities on the ground. I was having a conversation with a Serbian forestry project, which is likely to be one of our second or third projects. And we actually got in a very good methodology to just have a conversation about what would it look like if we went down this route of certifying the carbon with you. And it was basically just a long list of reasons why native exists. The barriers to entry were so high, there was no chance that this project would ever have been able to meet them. It's too small, didn't have enough money, didn't have enough scale. And even if you have all that, you're then diverting all these resources that should be going to the land and to the communities to these third parties.
Paperwork.
And paperwork, basically. Bean counting, paperwork, bureaucracy, left brain all over again. So we didn't want to go down that route with the first project. In reality, the native map could actually accommodate any type of project, including completely mainstream carbon offset projects.
Okay.
But we just didn't want our first project to be that, and it wasn't suitable. And in the end, what we decided is that there's so much debate about what's the best certification, what's the best body, what's the best methodology, which standard should we use, that we're going to be methodology agnostic. The native map is there. The native square is the same size for whatever project. When you buy a native square, you're not necessarily buying this credit or that standard. You are quite simply protecting this much rainforest or restoring this much coral reefs, whatever it is. And you own all the environmental rights to that square. So in theory, you can do whatever analysis you want at any point during the next 40 years. If there's some EU regulation in 20 years which says all companies have to have this biodiversity unit, well, you can prove that you protected X amount of rainforest in 2026. It meant that we don't have to be the arbiter of what the correct methodology is. Essentially, you're buying the environmental rights from us, you're protecting these areas, and then you can do whatever analysis you want. So that was a real trade-off between, in the short term, might be hard to sell to large corporates with net zero targets, but in the long term, it means that a native square is future-proofed from evolving regulations and standards, and we don't have to know up front what they all are, which is a huge advantage.
I mean, especially given how complicated the trajectory of environmental protection regulation is at the moment, that does actually sound like a really good selling point. I think one of the things that does beg a question is, you talk about you're selling the environmental rights. How do you get those? So how does it actually work in terms of the relationship? How do you get the ownership of the environmental rights for that land or ocean?
Yeah, so you have to deal with the landowner, which in the case of the first project is the Indigenous communities have customary land rights. So we signed a long bespoke legal document with them defining this term environmental rights, which is basically anything carbon, anything biodiversity, anything social impact. No claim on the land itself, but we have the right to sort of package those and sell those to third parties. The funny thing about all this is that again, it'll be totally different with other projects. There might be just a private landowner, like we might be doing one in Somerset where it's just a private landowner, so it's a bit simpler, the agreement.
Yeah.
But if we were to do the same thing with Indigenous communities in forest, we might actually just do something akin to what that Swedish billionaire did, where actually what we'll do is we'll just sign a logging license and then not log it. Because from a legal point of view, that's simpler. Yeah, and they've been doing this with coal mines as well, coal mine abatement, where I just buy up the coal mine and the coal mining company, and then I just stop mining the coal. And actually that's simpler and more legally enforceable than the document that we have that is a bit complex and bespoke.
That's fascinating. I will add a link to information about that for the listeners, because that is incredibly cool, but also speaks to the absolute mess that we're in, that it's easier to use a document that was drawn up to drive extraction is the best document on which to build protection.
This is where this gets really funny as well. So the whole additionality narrative says carbon tons must be additional. So if it's intact rainforest, I have to prove that it would have been chopped down. By the way, there is actually new technology with flux towers, which can prove that actually intact ecosystems actually do remove carbon as well. So actually avoided deforestation is not the only way. But in any case, as it stands, it makes it very hard to finance intact rainforest.
Yeah.
But what if we bought the logging rights?
Well, then you've got proof that it was a
go out,
risk.
dress up as a lumberjack with an axe and be like, look, it's additional, finance the squares, but what a stupid sort of cul-de-sac that we've got ourselves into, that the key question is it all going to get chopped down tomorrow? We shouldn't have to answer that question. We still know it needs financing.
This is one of the problems when you're talking about this issue of, we know it needs financing, it's crazy to use this whole problem of counterfactuals and would something have been chopped down or not is one of the things that caused the big scandals in the carbon markets in the first place, based on contracts and ideas that were put together 20, 25 years ago. And people now know, well, is that a sensible way of making money? It's like renewables, because I remember back when you could only get renewable projects credited under the CDM if they were not going to happen in exactly the same way as we talk about carbon. But because renewable energy was cheaper and it's decentralized and all of these things, so many countries put in place policies that said, we're going to have 20% of our energy from renewable sources by XYZ. Well, that means it's not additional because it's part of where the government's going. So this whole idea about when things change, how they change and why they change is one of the challenges that underpins the system as a whole, because it's completely confusing to anyone who isn't immersed in it all day, every day. So that means that trust is the key issue. Trust in what's being done and why it's being done. And how do you actually make that work? I mean, I suppose what you're talking about with the logging model, or not logging as the case may be, that's actually a brilliant way of just getting around the problem altogether. But your model is about basically working with Indigenous communities and ensuring that there is the right relationship, there is a trust that these things are happening. With your model, how much of that is designed in? And how much of it is dependent on having the right contract, on people and governance working well together?
All that madness you mentioned is sort of left brain par excellence, right? This is where we land. And I think this is both the value and the difficulty of trying to match up these corporate expectations with how communities view the forest, is that they do live much more in their right brain. They view the forest as a living thing with an identity. Even breaking it down into the square size is a kind of violence, really, to what they see as a bit of forest with an identity. So there's just this huge gap between this very spreadsheety, bureaucratic way of looking at nature that corporates do and the way communities do. And you have to somehow marry those two in a way that ultimately gives companies what they need, which is it's a way for them to benefit and prosper from protecting nature, and also doesn't do violence to the way communities view their land, the way they view nature, and doesn't sacrifice that integrated, holistic view of nature on the altar of let's make nature investable. I saw a really great quote from this woman called Alice Leguay, who I spoke to just before Christmas, saying, the question is not how can we make nature investable? The question is, can finance in its current form ever truly serve life?
I mean, that's the ultimate question.
And it's so spot on. We've been incredibly lucky with the communities that we work with, that they've been honestly incredible to work with. They've got really good trust between the local NGO and the communities themselves, very good communication, and they've done an amazing job of trusting that when we come to them with some change to the legal agreement that we need to make, or some corporates asking for this, can we do this, in order to help us raise investment, they've been very understanding and very trusting. I think we've been very lucky in that case. But with all these relationships, trust is key. We do need to trust every project we work with that they are going to protect the forest or they are going to restore the mangroves. And, ultimately, without trust, it's impossible.
I think what's fascinating to me here is what is trust? And actually what you have is a situation where all these different people are involved in different ways at different stages, and you have different experiences and perceptions and jobs that you do. But in the end, you are aligned in wanting to protect this piece of forest. And as long as your goals are aligned, the way you get there doesn't really matter, and you can trust in that person to do things in the right way, I guess.
We don't know how to protect rainforest more than the communities do. I mean, look at the Malaita on a map. It's so intact. There are some palm oil plantations in certain areas, but actually the vast majority of it is really, really intact ecosystems. And that can only be because Indigenous communities have remained in place and they have rights. It's as simple as that. I mean, Indigenous communities who remain in place and have land rights are more effective at protecting nature than national parks. It's just that too often they're doing it with no resources and often lacking basic necessities.
Well, and there's also the fact that to a great extent, there are a lot of places where governments have taken over that land. They have just basically said it is government land, not owned by the Indigenous peoples. And that does make things much more complicated.
Yeah.
But again, that's one of the governance issues that perhaps does need to be addressed. But what you're doing is taking a different approach to that problem and working where you can have most impact.
Yeah, precisely. There's so many types of projects that have been just sort of underserved by the mainstream model. I mean, another example is mangrove restoration. And the example you gave about government owning the land is often the key issue. I mean, pretty much all mangroves in a lot of countries is government land. And so in order to do any kind of nature finance or mangrove restoration or protection, you need the government to come to the table. And too often they're incredibly slow. They haven't worked out their blue carbon policy or whatever it is. And in 5 years, maybe they will. And in the meantime, we have active mangrove restoration projects going on in Philippines and Tanzania. And we can't really sell native squares because we can't get hold of the government.
It's crazy. One of the arguments against action is always, well, there's so many other things to do and there's so many other pressures. And it's like, yeah, no shit, Sherlock. That's what being government is. And you have to balance out what is an immediate problem, what is an urgent problem, and what is critical over time. And it does feel like government is not set up to do that because otherwise they'd be doing a better job of it. But I want to come back to this thing about Indigenous peoples and the local communities, because you're talking about really any community can be the local community protecting the land in the right way. I'm interested in what you've learned about how to make those relationships work. So what I mean by that is, what is the hardest thing to get right about ensuring that you are sharing control and the benefits and the actual process of decision making when you're working out how to protect the land?
It's very time intensive and resource intensive to properly and thoroughly consult. And we're still working out the model that works best. So we're still working out what corporates buy or how we can frame this in a way that can unlock corporate marketing budgets or employee rewards schemes. And so just that constant having to tweak our model and exactly what we need to be able to do, while also, making sure that we're consulting comprehensively with the communities is a constant challenge. But there will be projects that we will have where Indigenous communities aren't at the heart of it. I mean, I gave the example of this bit of biodiversity uplift project that we're going to have in Somerset. It's actually a private landowner, and yes, there's some communities nearby, and we will be tracking the benefits to them and to what extent they've been consulted, etc. But it's not their lands, and there might be marine projects as well where we do seagrass to restoration, where it's actually quite far removed from human settlements. There's going to be a whole range of models, but there's no question that working with Indigenous communities and trying to map it onto corporate expectations is a real challenge. And that's sort of largely our role, is to act as that bridge between those two very different worlds.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons why it's taken so long to finance properly protected rainforest. And there's been so much malpractice, and sometimes it's the result of actually bad faith actors, but sometimes just the result of sloppy thinking. Like, this obsessive focus on carbon means that some projects ended up removing communities from the land because they're like, well, you might chop down some trees. It's like so reductionist and myopic.
It's the accounting mindset.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing wrong with accounting. Incredibly useful, really important. Shouldn't be the be-all and end-all of life.
And needs to be in service of the bigger picture. The left brain is supposed to be the emissary in service of the master, which is the right brain. Like, that's Dr. Ian McGilchrist's work, not the boss.
I suppose one thing that does bring up when you're talking about your role acting as a translator of the different goals and needs, are there situations where this model wouldn't make sense for particular companies or industries? Because for individuals, I think it seems quite straightforward. If you want to put some money towards protecting nature, you can. But for companies, how does that work?
So in theory, like I said, the native approach is we take conservation and regeneration projects and we break them down into tangible, tradable, visible environmental assets called native squares, which are 3 square meters of nature. So in theory, our map can be used really to onboard any type of project with any type of certification or any type of analysis with any type of credit attached to it. So there's no one that we couldn't cater to with that approach. In practice, our first project is super biodiverse. It involves intact, pristine rainforest. And so it's probably not the right approach for you if you're a company with a net zero target and you just want to hit the target in a cost-effective way. And right there is the whole problem, because, actually protecting rainforest is far, far, far cheaper than planting a load of trees and creating additional carbon that way. It's far, far cheaper than technology-based reductions like carbon capture or anything like this. And yet we've kind of backed ourselves into a place where that's not the logical option for companies who want to meet their net zero target. So that should ring alarm bells just to begin with. When you speak to people at large corporates and companies, the real people in these roles, the heads of sustainability, chances are they've ended up there because they love nature, they care about biodiversity. And often these companies will talk about the importance of biodiversity, or they'll talk about the importance of Indigenous communities on their website. But when it comes down to it, at the end of the negotiation, they want a cheap carbon ton. And so we find ourselves having to compete with projects which really are just a ton of carbon. Yeah. Whereas a native square in this first project is carbon, but it's also biodiversity, it's also social impact as well.
And that's the thing that has never made sense to me. If you can combine positive social impact with positive environmental impact with payment for a benefit that has been created by policy, which is the carbon benefit, it's this problem that if you can't financialize it, people won't pay for it. Or at least companies don't pay for it.
This is where I think we can move the conversation onwards, because we've designed nature protection, nature finance like a market. I mean, obviously unfettered markets were the whole reason why we got into this problem in the first place. So
very true.
Perhaps another market is not the only way. And I think rather than thinking about it as a market, we need to start thinking about it as marketing. Companies care what we think about them. Their employees care what they think about, or rather they care what their employees think about them. They care what their clients think about them. And for the reasons that I've already mentioned, that, a ton of carbon makes people roll their eyes. But if you can say we've protected this much rainforest, people go, wow, that's amazing. And so I think there's a route here with the help of regulation, I think, is going to play a really important role, which so far all the regulation for corporates tends to involve asking them to do more measuring and not doing more action. But hopefully that will catch up.
Well, it's almost like we need to look at outcomes rather than processes, that there are things that we want to achieve and that should be what's actually set out there. Because I do worry sometimes about the shift towards thinking about this sort of protection as marketing. I think there is definitely a question about the impact on reputation and communication. But I remember the days of CSR, where corporate social responsibility was basically something companies did to look good. And they did it if they had the money and time, and it was never prioritized. It was never integral. And I feel really strongly that nature and the protection of nature and biodiversity has in some way got to become internalized into business, an actual corporate recognition of the fact that you won't exist without nature. So really it's in your long-term benefit and your short-term benefit to protect it.
And maybe regulation can help bring that about.
Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting the discrepancy you made between outcomes and processes, because you're totally right in corporate climate and corporate sustainability. There's a lot of work on the process and the outcome is often, minimal or piecemeal. Interestingly, when it comes to nature protection, there are some types of nature where actually the outcome is so hard to be certain about, but you still need to go through the process.
Okay.
So, for example, seagrass protection. So seagrass is huge carbon sink, very important for marine biodiversity. And let's say I want to finance this huge bit of seagrass to protect it, enforce regulation, force the trawlers don't come by and whatever.
Yeah.
A single boat which just goes through that with a drift net or drags an anchor can destroy a huge amount of seagrasses. And so however much I spend on financing it and protecting it, it's impossible for me to say 100% that it's still going to be there.
Yeah.
And so actually if the carbon ton at the end of it all, but even just whatever.
Even if it's not there, the process is the protection. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I apologize because this is something I go on about way too much, which is that we need to have more nuance in all of the conversations that we have. And this is a prime example of that's a problem. This is the logical solution. Well, it might be logical, but it's not practical or realistic for the thing we're actually trying to achieve.
Yeah, exactly. And there's lots of mangrove restoration is another one. I can plant a load of mangroves, but I can't prove 100% there won't be a storm surge which wipes them out. Does it mean I shouldn't plant them? Of course not. So actually we do, in some nature projects, we really do need to make it about, okay, we're this large company, we've done this amazing mangrove restoration project. Can we say for sure what the outcomes are going to be? No, but actually those companies should still benefit from that.
While those mangroves are there, they are contributing to cleaner water, cleaner air, protection from storm surges, lower risk, better quality of life, more effective fisheries in that area. So yes, absolutely, they should benefit from the fact that by doing that, they have brought those benefits to that part of the world. Oh.
This is I've got a friend called George who's really cracked this because he's managed to localize. He's doing oyster reef restoration, but he's localized it to the supply chain of the company that he's working with, which is Nestle.
Oh, that's clever.
So literally, it actually benefits them in a direct economic way. So of course, they can unleash the money, and that's a very smart approach if you can make it work. Yeah. Obviously, the reason it doesn't work in a lot of intact ecosystems, again, for the simple reason that the reason why the forest is still intact is because it doesn't connect with many companies' supply chains. So the last few remaining intact places that's often quite hard to make that connection, but not impossible.
There is something really interesting here about trying to bring together, as you say, the process of having these bits of nature protected alongside the outcomes that we actually want, bringing in commercial awareness of the impact of that protection and the risk management services that supplies with financialization. And yep, definitely this is a lot about nuance and very complicated. And you said at the beginning that I sounded like I knew what I was talking about, and what you've made me realize is I have so much to learn. But I think that's just a facet of being in this world. There is always something new to learn.
Yeah. Well, in this type of space, often the experts are the ones who sound the most insane. So actually, I think there's no harm in that.
Well, that's good. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you think I should have done?
I think we've covered it all. I mean, one question is about how companies can use these squares.
Oh, yeah.
Because, of course, ultimately, we do need to obviously make it in companies' interest to buy these things. And yes, we might have some offsetting projects, but we need to obviously go beyond carbon as the only thing that matters. And so one thing that we found is that companies end up using squares for employee engagement or even employee behavior change. Like we want you all to fill out this survey, but actually no one ever does. But if you complete the survey, we'll gift you a square of rainforest. Or MPB, which is the world's largest secondhand camera marketplace, they use it to reward their employees every time they pass long service milestones. So there's lots of different ways in which you can do that. And then the other one is client engagement. So we've got a partner called Canopy Cloud. There's cloud computing and data marketplace. And every contract they sign to provide cloud computing services or broker a deal, they give 1% of that to protecting nature. So again, you're like directly linking it to their sales and almost incentivizing, upselling their services, right?
And can I just say that does make perfect sense, because the two major concerns that come along with cloud computing are energy and water consumption, both of which have a detrimental effect on nature. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So there are these levers. You've just got to find them, and you've got to do this translation job. But there are levers, and there's no shortage of people within these companies who want to do good. So it's just about finding those people and then framing it in a way that they can get the sign-off they need.
Wonderful. So for anyone who is interested, do go to the website, which I will add details to the show notes, because you can actually see where it is that you're protecting, can't you?
Yeah.
It just makes it really real. The last question I have to ask you is just for our listeners. It's so difficult trying to make sense of claims around nature-based solutions and what that actually means. Is there one question that everybody should always be asking, no matter who's offering the solution?
Yeah, I would ask, what's the benefit share? Okay. So if I've bought this credit or ton or square or tree planting or whatever, how is that money being split? Because so often, a lot of it, often far more than 50%, is going towards middlemen, certifiers, bean counters in the middle.
That's crazy.
And the communities or the project gets a tiny, tiny fraction of the revenue. So in the case of our project, the first project, 80% of the money will benefit local Indigenous communities, sometimes via biodiversity monitoring and measuring and employment, but ultimately sometimes education programs, healthcare programs. But you won't find very many other competitors out there which offer similar revenue share. And often it's because they've had to spend six figures on some certification in the middle. So that would be the first question I'd ask.
Excellent. Well, I think that's going to be very useful for people who are looking at whether or not they do want to get involved in all of this. So, Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really interesting learning what you're doing at Native Squared. But I think before we wrap up, it's important to just take a step back and look at the bigger picture, because what we're really talking about is financing nature protection is not just a technical challenge, it's a question of judgment. So it's thinking about the fact that every different model or approach to financing that protection is making different choices about what counts, what gets protected, who has a say, and where responsibility starts and ends. So there's often a discussion about the fact that there isn't enough money going towards nature protection, but I don't think it's a lack of money or a lack of good intentions, but all the challenges around mistaking participation for impact. It's getting funding for something in order to get away with doing something somewhere else. And I think that's why all the things we've been talking about trust and governance, and I suppose clear limits and boundaries and agreements, they matter just as much as scale does. So one of the things we need to be aware of is we're going to see new policies and we're going to see new markets and we're going to see new contribution models. But I think the test is not going to be how innovative they sound or how marketable they are, but whether or not they genuinely support long-term stewardship without becoming a substitute for the deeper change we need in how we view finance and nature and the relationship between the two. Anyway, as always, to our listeners, thank you for listening today. Our aim is not to offer answers, but actually to help you ask better questions. So I hope you found it useful. Don't forget to share the podcast, follow us on social, and we'll be back next week.